Welcome back. So we're now going to start chapter 1 of our book, A Pinch of Magic. And this chapter is entitled Trick or Treat. Now you need to listen very carefully because at the end of this chapter I'm going to set a question which I want you to have a go at answering. So let's get going. So we read the prologue, and the prologue is a little bit like setting the scene, if you like. So we've been introduced to a young girl who is being accused of being a witch, and she's been locked in a tower. We know that she is scheduled to be executed, but it was left there, so we never know actually what happened to her, whether or not she was executed or whether she escaped. So I've got a feeling that she's got something to do with the curse that the sisters and the family have. So let's get on with our story and find out a little bit more about these three sisters and this family curse. So chapter 1, Trick or Treat. Betty Widdershins first learned of the family curse on the night of her birthday. It was her 13th, a number considered unlucky for some, but Betty was too practical to believe in all of that. She liked to think she was too practical to believe in most superstitious nonsense, despite having grown up around it. It was a Saturday, always a busy night in Betty's home, which was the village inn. The Poacher's Pocket was the rowdiest place on the Isle of Crowstone. It had been in the Widdershins family for generations, and it now belonged to her granny, also named Betty, but whom everyone called Bunny, to avoid confusion. They lived there with Betty's sister Felicity, known as Fliss, who was the eldest, and the 6-year-old Charlotte, who would only answer to Charlie. Betty's birthday also happened to fall on Halloween. As she and Charlie galloped downstairs, their trick-or-treat costumes billowing behind them in a satisfying villainous way. In fact, the outfit was helping Betty to feel rather daring, which she was glad of, as she and Charlie were about to break Granny's biggest rule. Only Charlie didn't know it yet. As he threw open the door to the lounge bar, warm beer-scented air hit Betty's nostrils through the holes in her skeleton mask. She picked up Granny's favourite horseshoe, which had clattered onto the floor, and placed it above the door frame. Charlie did her best witch's cackle to announce their entrance and swished her cape. Grabbing Granny's broomstick from the corner, she began dancing around the scuffed tables and mismatched chairs, chanting as her eyes sparkled in her painted green face. Trick or treat, trick or treat, the marshes are misty, but the sugar is sweet. She twirled and hopped like a little imp, as the regulars looked on in amusement. Careful, Charlie, Betty called, eyeing her sister's cape near the crackling fire. She had lit them earlier, after she and Charlie had carved pumpkins into jack-o'-lanterns. She adjusted her long black cloak and motioned impatiently to Granny, who was wiping down the bar. We're off now, Granny, she said, thankful her face was now hidden behind the mask. She had been planning this evening for weeks, only feeling excitement, but now that it had come to carrying it out, she couldn't quite believe her own disobedience. She hoped Granny wouldn't put the tremor in her voice down to excitement and not nerves that were buzzing around her like marsh midges. Granny stamped over. She stamped everywhere instead of walking, slammed doors instead of closing them, and mostly shouted rather than talked. Off out scrounging, she said, blowing a grey hair out of her face. It's trick-or-treating, Betty corrected, and everybody does it. Granny tutted. Well, I'm aware of what everybody does, thank you, and it looks like scrounging to me, when you could be being useful here. I've been useful all day, Betty muttered snappily. Under the hot mask, her bushy hair itched against her neck. So much for birthdays. Granny snorted. Birthdays or not, all the Widdershins had to help run the place, even Charlie. Now, Only go round the green, Granny ordered. No further, do you hear? And I want you back by supper time, Betty finished. I know. Well, mind you are, and remember what happened last year. Granny's voice softened. There's a birthday cake for later. Ooh, said Charlie, pausing her little imp dance at the mention of food. Betty caught Fliss's eye as Granny was called away to serve a customer. Are you sure you won't come with us? Betty asked. A note of pleading entered her voice. It had always been such fun when the three of them were getting their Halloween costumes each year. It won't be the same without you. Fliss shook her head, her dark, glossy hair swishing over her shoulders. There was a faint smear of green on her perfect upturned nose from where she had planted Charlie's face with a kiss earlier. I'm too old for all of that. Besides, I'm needed here. Or maybe you won't want to miss Will Turner coming in, Betty joked. Or is it Jack Humble this week who's getting the Fliss kiss? Oh, I can't keep up, Fliss glared. I've told you not to call me that. Betty rolled her eyes, deciding to keep quiet about the paint on her sister's nose. Since her birthday, Fliss hadn't been herself. She was quiet, even moody at times, and clammed up every time Betty asked what was troubling her. Betty, Fliss said, glancing wearily at Granny, you will stay by the green, won't you? Under her mask, Betty gulped. She crossed her fingers within the folds of her cloak and fibbed. Yeah, we'll stay by the green. Fliss's expression was unreadable as she gazed past Betty into the window. You best to stay close anyway. It's looking a bit foggy out there. Taking a ferry over the marshes could be dangerous. She turned away to serve the hoity-toity regular named Queenie, who was rapping on the counter impatiently. Betty rolled her eyes at her sister's back. Mustn't do this, can't do that, she muttered under her breath. What happened to Fliss since her birthday? True, she was as vain as she had always been, often staring broodily at the old mermaid mirror that Granny had given her. But all the fun seemed to have been blown away with the candles on her cake. In fact, she had started sounding exactly like Granny. Increasingly, Betty felt as though her life at the Poacher's Pocket was a corset tightening around her, with Granny pulling on one string and now Fliss yanking on the other, lacing her in so that she couldn't breathe. Well, tonight Betty was determined to cut those strings, if only for a little while. She called to Charlie, who had interrupted a dominoes game, and to proudly show off the gap in her front teeth, where her teeth had fallen out. Today, and together Betty and Charlie headed for the door, weaving past the tables of familiar faces that Betty knew as well as her own. They were almost at the door when Charlie's foot tangled in Betty's cloak and she tripped, bumping into the table, where a sour-faced fellow named Figarty sat alone. He made an unfriendly noise between a grunt and a growl, scowling at his drink that slopped against the side of the glass. Sorry, Betty mumbled, hurrying past. Ice air snaked around her ankles as she and Charlie squeezed past more customers who were now piling inside. Then they were out into the freezing night. But oh, what a night! Freedom! Or at least it would be once they were firmly on the ferry in a few minutes' time. Betty silently cheered, shivering as much from the anticipation as from the cold. She felt a flutter of anxiety too. Fliss had been right. It was looking a little misty out here. As far as Betty knew, for she had been checking, there was no fog forecast. Yet she also knew the marshes were unpredictable and that sometimes the forecasts were wrong. Charlie's breath came in white puffs as she ran ahead, shaking her empty cauldron, the cold not bothering her. Betty strode after her, her eyes sweeping, Nesselnook Green. There were a few costumed people going from door to door, and she counted 5 pumpkins glowing on the doorsteps. Most of the houses, however, were in darkness. Many people had no wish to be disturbed by masked strangers, for no good reason. Last year Halloween fun had been cut short when the bell of Crowstone had started clanging, with an alarm which meant that across the marshes the prison beacons had been lit, signifying danger. Calls of trick or treat had been replaced with cries of "Prisoner on the loose!" Everyone inside, lock your doors. Betty and her sisters had raced back to the Poacher's Pocket and sat upstairs, their noses pressed up to Betty's window, while Fliss nervously chewed her nails and Charlie complained on losing out on the sweets. Betty had fizzled with excitement, secretly hoping prisoners might stay on the run for a few days, just to shake Crowstone up a bit. Escapes were rare, and growing up at prisoners in a prison shadow meant they could almost forget how close it was and how dangerous it might be. The girls had watched and waited, but apart from 2 prison wardens searching with lanterns, they had seen nobody. By breakfast the excitement was over, for they'd heard that the felons had been caught on the marshes. Betty had always followed any tales of escape with interest, as she sometimes felt like a prisoner herself. Unfortunately, the stories of inmates on the loose had been added to Granny's collection of excuses which prevented the girls from wandering too far. Snapping back to the present, Betty glanced at the Poacher's Pocket. Fliss had once described it as a knackered old racing pigeon, with its loose tiles and shutters flapping like ragged feathers. It perched against the edge of Nesselnook Green, its weathered bricks a patchwork of years gone by. Time had nudged it like an elbow, and now the whole building slumped drunkenly to the left. The light from the windows glowed amber, broken by moving figures within, and a few hagstones and other lucky charms Granny had hung up, but no one outside, no one suspected. Good. The possibility of being hauled back by an enraged Granny, both scared and humiliating. Sure, Granny had a foul temper, but it was the consequence Betty feared most. If Granny found out what Betty had planned, she would never let her take Charlie out alone again, and any chance of adventure would vanish. The corset laces were tightened, squeezing the life out of her. Already Charlie had knocked on the first house, chorusing "Trick or treat!" before sweets were popped into the cauldron. She skipped back to Betty, unwrapping a sticky beaked toffee from Hubbard's, the sweet shop. "Didn't you bring anything to put your treats in?" "Nah," said Betty. "I'll just pinch a couple of yours," poking through the cauldron until she found her favourite, a marsh melt. A plume of powdered sugar wafted off as she stuffed it into her mouth, crunching through the wafer shell into the whipped centre. She checked the clock on the craggy old church as they neared the lane beside it. 7 minutes. Under the mask, temples prickled with sweat as she paused, as her pulse began to race. "We can't get caught now, not when we're so close." With another glance, Betty back at the inn, she took Charlie's sleeve and urged her towards the lane. "This way. I've got a surprise for you." And we're going to leave it there. So that's part 1 of our chapter 1. We've still got to finish chapter 1, but my question to you is, where do you think Charlie's going? And what do you think the surprise is going to be? So, check back with me for our next instalment of part 2 of chapter 1, and I'll see you there.